Hey, so right now I'm reading through the first few chapters of Deuteronomy and just going back over some first impressions because I haven't read it in a while, and my goal is to kind of walk you through how to study this part of Scripture. And so you'll notice in chapter 1 that Moses is at the end of the 40 years in the wilderness, and he is talking to the Israelites because the Lord has commanded him to. And so he starts recapping where they've been and what happened. And so this is Moses speaking to the Israelites. And you start working through the rest of chapter 1, and it talks about how they delegated out judgment where there'd be leaders over the people, over different groups of people, and people could go to these leaders whenever they had a problem with somebody else. And if a major issue came up, they could appeal to Moses. And so you have a delegated authority and leadership happening that way. And then it talks about when they departed Horeb. Now, Horeb, H-O-R-E-B, is another word for Mount Sinai in that region there. And so that's what he's referring to when he says that they came to Mount Horeb. Because remember, 40 years earlier, they left Egypt. They came to Mount Sinai, Mount Horeb, and were given the 10 Commandments and were to go out and start conquering the land, but because of their disobedience, God judged them. And so this is kind of a recapping of the events lining up for that. So as you start looking into the rest of chapter 1 and into chapter 2, it talks about how they journeyed through the wilderness and they crossed through different areas. And you're probably just like me. You're not remembering, or maybe you never knew where these places were. So without a Bible map, these just sound like random places. They don't really have any meaning to you. There's names of kings. I mean, it does point to this being a historical event. This is definitely not some sort of symbology going on. These are historical events that happened. As you start reading through these chapters, you're going to notice that Moses talks about both how he led as well as how the people reacted and how God acted. And so we can learn a lot about the relationship of God and man in these cases, as well as the restrictions that were put on them, the judgments, the rules for them to listen to and obey, even the I would say prophecies, if you will. There's foreshadowing from a narrative standpoint, prophecies from another perspective, that they're basically being warned that in future generations they are going to stray, that they're going to act corruptly, that they're going to fall into idolatry, that they're going to fall into evil, and this is going to provoke God to anger, and that they're going to have problems because of that. And I think part of that is so that when it happens, they know that God knew it was going to happen, and that this is an opportunity for them to respond correctly. Okay, and so into chapter 4, we really get into emphasizing obeying God and following His commandments and statutes, and how this is really God showing the Israelites His favor, that they are His favored people and that they're going to be blessed, but those blessings come with strings. And this goes back to the covenants. The covenant with Abraham was a promise. They didn't have to do anything to be His people, but to be maintained in the land, according to the covenant with Moses back in Exodus, you find there are strings attached, that there are blessings with obedience and cursings with disobedience. And so they're being reminded of this so that they can be prosperous by obeying God. It also reminds them of God's great deeds on their behalf, that He rescued them from Egypt. He brought them great victories as they started conquering the land 40 years ago. But there's also judgment. Okay, so then in chapter 5, the transition goes from the history lesson, the reminder of what happened 40 years earlier, to the truth that this covenant doesn't just apply to their ancestors, it applies to them. Chapter 5 begins with, "And Moses called all Israel and said to them, Hear, O Israel, the statutes and judgments which I speak in your hearing today, that you may learn them and be careful to observe them. The Lord our God has made a covenant with us in Horeb. The Lord did not make this covenant with our fathers, but with us, those who are here today, all of us who are alive." That's not to say that he didn't make a covenant with them. It's emphasizing by contrast this covenant is applying to them right now. So they can't say, oh, that was just for our fathers. It's a kind of hyperbolic language to say that he didn't make this covenant with their predecessors. It's just emphasize that this applies to them right now, and that's what they need to be paying attention to. And so then it goes through the Ten Commandments again for the next several verses. I mean, probably 20 verses in chapter 5 are dedicated to the re-giving of the Ten Commandments. So then you get towards the end of chapter 5, and it says, after reminding them in several different ways to obey these commandments so that as they possess the land, they'll be blessed. It says in verse 32, therefore you shall be careful to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. You shall walk in all the ways which Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you shall possess. So it is just giving them perspective on if they want blessings and a long life in the promised land, then they need to be dedicated to God. They don't need to turn to the left or right. When it says you shall walk in all the ways, the term walk means it's a way of life. That this should be your culture, your habits, your daily activity. It's the way you live. And this sets the scene for chapter 6.